Hey guys, John Paulamy here, Actionable Intelligence. Today is another in the Actionable Intelligence interview series, and today we have an excellent guest. He is the Emeritus Prince Philip Professor of Technology at the University of Cambridge. He was a Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Department for Communities and Local Government, and he is a Fellow of the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering, and is a trustee of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And our guest today is Dr. Michael Kelly. And we wanted to have Professor Kelly on. He talks about the challenge of meeting climate change goals from a engineering and material way of how we're going to reach these goals. We want to have him on today to talk about what the real challenges are, because they're not really discussed. What precipitated this conversation was his recent paper that I read on the internet called the Electrifying the UK and the Want of Engineering. So we wanted to welcome you on board, Dr. Kelly, and discuss your paper that you wrote about the want of engineering, referencing the electrification of the UK.
Thank you very much, John.
So what I wanted to get started I don't want to get into the politics here. What I want to get into, because your paper is very, it's short, but it's very to the point. And one of the things that I read in here was the first introduction to your paper. The lead-in is the scale of the task. So yes. Can you talk from the perspective of your paper, or however you do, about what we're actually trying to do here with references to becoming CO2 neutral, or these ambiguous targets that are put out, and what that really means in reality, and from an engineering and materials perspective, and how that can actually be accomplished, or what the real challenges are?
Certainly, thank you, John, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to expound my views. The point is very simple at the moment. Governments and political groups and NGOs and everybody are wedded to such things as the net zero global economy of 2050. And it sounds good, it trips off the tongue, and it's an appropriate upping of the ante after the 10 years of trying to reduce our carbon emissions by 80%. But these high-level ambitions, as soon as you try and cascade them down to a finite number of very large and complex civil engineering projects that would actually deliver what is implied rather by the 2050 net zero global economy, you start to come up against some challenges which are way beyond mankind's ability to even contemplate it. Now, I've got lots and lots of examples, but I'll just pick one or two. Everybody's very keen on electric cars, and electric cars need batteries. And of course, when you have an early adopter and early examples such as Tesla, and you're the first person in your street to have a Tesla, things are fine. But if you actually take the number of vehicles, I don't have it off the top of my head, but if it was 100 million, let's have a look, there are 9 billion people on the world, say 5 billion vehicles of one kind or another, and you start to work out how much material will be used for batteries, the numbers just become mind-blowing. Give you a practical example. You know, the UK is about 1.5% of CO2 emissions. It's a relatively small country on the scale of things. But if we were suddenly to convert all of our cars, and I'm not talking about trucks or logistic vehicles, but of all of our cars to electric vehicles, we would need nearly half of all the copper mined in the world in a year. We would need twice as much of some of the other rare earth materials that go into batteries in smaller quantities. We'd need about half of the world's supply of lithium. This is just to turn, you know, the United Kingdom, population 50 million, so probably 20 million cars or so. And when you say, well, where is all this copper going to come from? Where is all this? And you look at the global reserves that are known, you suddenly see a mismatch. And of course, Britain being only 1/50th, you need 50 years of this while everybody else does it at once. So you start to say, well, we're going to need more material of these materials than we know whereabouts. And so you then go one step further than that and say, look, even with all the efforts, if we could get that, we will find that vast majority of these materials are going to come from unstable regimes. And in particular, the rare earth metals will come from China, and China is perfectly capable of turning these on and off. We'll have a new form of OPEC, and a number of the other materials, the cobalt, for example, used not only in batteries, and everybody tells me it'll be out of battery, that material will be out of battery soon, and I'm quite happy with that, but cobalt's still used in the nacelles of wind turbines for the magnets and so on. This all comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's mainly child labor. So when everybody says that the change from fossil fuels to renewables and so on is going to be an effort, they'll concede that, it's going to be more than an effort. It's going to be a massive struggle. And I just don't see, when you count up the number of engineers that will be needed to deliver it, how we're going to get there. So I've done a number of studies. Unfortunately, they're nearly all confined to the UK. But I would recommend anybody who wants to see the best thing written about the UK and energy is a book which is free online by a colleague of mine, since died recently, unfortunately, David Mackay, and it's called Without Hot Air. So if you Google the phrase without hot air as one word, you'll get it all. And what he's done is just to do the basic numbers for the UK. And I'll give you another example with batteries, this is all on the theme of the sheer scale. I was going to the railway station here in Cambridge a few months ago, and somebody gave me a leaflet, and it turned out it was from Extinction Rebellion, which I think you have in the States as well as we have here. And this person was quite clear that the backup electricity at the local hospital here, Addenbrooke's Hospital, a big teaching hospital, will be provided by batteries in 2025. So I came home and did the sums, and the sums are quite revealing. Elon Musk put a battery outside Adelaide about 18 months ago to power that city, as it has a lot of power cuts because of the lack of fossil fuels. It cost 90 million Australian dollars. That's roughly the same in US dollars, about 45 million pounds here. Now, if I was to transport that battery and put it next to Addenbrooke's, it would run the emergency wards of the hospital. That's about 30% of the hospital. It would run it on one 80% to 20% discharge. You never charge a battery 100% and run it down to zero. So one standard discharge, it would run the hospital for 24 hours. Now, at the moment, that backup is provided by 2 diesel generators, which don't cost 45 million pounds, but 1/4 of 1 million pounds. So there's a ratio of 180 to 1 in the costs of the infrastructure, the basic capital costs of either battery powering or powering by diesel fuel. Now, the point is, if we had a massive storm in the east of England, which took down all the major transmission lines, it would be an order of a week before we got it up. And so if you multiply the 180 I just calculated by 7, you get 1,300. So the idea of running Addenbrooke's emergency services by batteries is 1,300 times more expensive than it would be with a diesel generator. Now, these numbers will come down, but it won't come down from 1,300 to 1 to 1. And in anything like 6 years. And it's these numbers, engineers will look at something and say, well, if there's a factor of 2 or 3 to 1, we could do the more expensive option. But when it's 1,300 to 1, this is just simple madness. And nobody would invest their own pension money into such a scheme. So those are just 2 or 3 examples. I've got others associated with just the distribution of electricity. For example, in a suburb here, we have 3-phase mains, and so houses are carefully set off one against the other for drawing their power off one phase or the other. And so on average, there's an equal draw. But if in a particular street, every 3rd house decided to have an electric car installed a rapid heater, it would blow the local distribution. And nobody's thought about these practical. We're going to have to replace not only the grid, but the distribution system. And nobody adds up the costs. I mean, I think that particular one is about 600 billion for the UK, 200 billion rather, let me not exaggerate, 200 billion pounds for the UK. So you get the story. There are example after example of example that when you take the large picture and cascade it down to a series of projects, you suddenly see it just doesn't add up.
No, and that's the point that I wanted to get to. Now, another thing is, like we talked before we started the interview, I did say that I'm in the renewable business, but one of the things that strikes me is that I say, okay, renewable, yes, the sun is going to exhaust its hydrogen in, several billion years. So I guess
Yes.
it's renewable, at least in our time frame.
Terminology, yes.
Yeah. So, but the problem is that I keep seeing is that the machines and devices that you need to convert the wind or the sun are not renewable. They have limited lifetimes. A solar panel is attacked by UV. It degrades over time. Probably has a 10-year service life. A wind turbine, in my experience has been they've touted them as being 25-year, 30-year machines, but I've seen them last only 12 years and then they repower them. So and then I think about, okay, well, from an engineering perspective, well, the foundation of this thing is made of reinforcing bar and concrete. Well, how do you manufacture Portland cement? And then how do you, so I start looking at things like energy return on energy invested. And I'm thinking, can this machine actually generate enough energy to not actually make a profit, but actually replace the energy? It may even, I haven't done a calculation, it's a net negative.
Well, I have done those. I did those a few years ago. I got into a bit of trouble. The problem with energy return on energy investment, which I think is a sound concept, if you think of a cheetah chasing a deer, if it spends more energy chasing the deer than it actually gets by eating the deer, the future of that cheetah is not in good shape. Similarly, if it's that cheetah is running a family and supporting that, it ought to actually get several times as much energy eating the deer than it actually expended chasing it. And there's a very similar thing like that. The numbers have been done. The big problem is where you draw the boundary. In the case of a cheetah and an animal, it's very clear. But in an energy system, for example, people say, well, when you use fossil fuel, you've got to, when I take a turbine, a 600 megawatt turbine from Siemens, when it's running, each kilogram of steel is supporting the generation of 2 kilowatts of energy, 2000 watts. But if I have high quality material in a turbine blade, in the shaft that, the vertical shaft that holds the turbine, the nacelle and everything else, or in large arrays of silicon, the typical amount of energy I get is not 2 kilowatts per kilogram of material, but 2 watts per kilogram. It's about 1,000 times less. And if somebody wants to tell me it's only 400 or 500 times less, I'm not going to argue with them, but it's more than 100 times less. And so these renewable energy systems are profligate in the use of materials. Now, when I discuss that, then everybody says to me, well, when you've got a coal-fired power station or an oil-fired power station, you're not including all the steel that's in the pipeline. And I say, but hang on a minute, I can treat that in money terms. This is what the fuel costs, and the fuel includes all of that. And whichever way you do it, you can find that you really do have a trouble. And it goes like this. If you have a piece of fuel that has an energy return on investment of one to one, all you can do with that piece of fuel is generate another piece of fuel. If you have a return of 5 to 1, that is the amount of effort you put in, you get 5 times as much energy in the fuel when you dig it out of the ground. Oil is typically 12, 14, 15 to 1. When you get this energy, you've got enough energy left over to grow food, to pay for the schooling of children and so on. But if you want to have the high arts, advanced medicine, and international travel and high performance electronics, you have to have an energy return of about 15 to 1 from the basic fuel. And you can get that with coal and gas and nuclear, but you can't get it with any of the renewables. And I always, trouble is when I start talking this, I always get arguments about people cavilling about where the boundaries are. But the basic idea is there is no renewable energy system that itself was made with renewable energy. And that would be an interesting date to put in the future. When will there be an energy system that's renewable that has been entirely generated with renewable energy in the first place?
No,
And
indeed.
I don't think that'll happen for 20 or 30 years.
I thought it was interesting. I just saw a recent article. The Swedes were developing, they were touting this new steelmaking methodology that was going to use hydrogen. And I started, there was no discussion of where the hydrogen came from. Which would have to come from natural gas or coal or something like that. But anyways, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you, having been in academia and, in engineering. Because I noticed this when it kind of bothered me. I've seen a lot of young engineers. I mean, I love being in engineering. I love building things. I love designing things. But I see the new crop of guys coming out, or people coming out, folks coming out of school, and I'm concerned because it's like these are math problems to me. I mean, these are spreadsheet exercises. These are not emotional responses or a political stance. I mean, everybody can have whatever political stance they want, but when you're in engineering, 2 + 2 has to equal 4, or the bridge doesn't hold up. So I guess my concern is, or some of my discussion, I kind of want to get your perspective on this a little bit, and not drifting into politics, but I mean, when you're doing the math and you're an engineer and you're looking at these things, I mean, you just can't get around it. I mean, is it just each person has to come to an epiphany on this, or just some people? I mean, I've had an electrical engineer tell me that CO2 is a pollutant, and I asked him about photosynthesis, and he wasn't really sure about it. I'm not even sure if some of these concepts are getting taught properly. I don't know.
Well, there's a lot of problems there. Let me just mention, I mentioned earlier that a decade or so ago, I was a government advisor. When I came back full-time to Cambridge, and by the way, one of the things about a great university is not so much the faculty, but how clever the students are. The students at Cambridge University Engineering Department went to the staff student liaison committee and said the following: you're doing a great job teaching us to be electronic engineers or mechanical engineers or civil engineers or information engineers or biotechnical engineers, but you're not teaching us how to be engineers of energy systems. And we think over the next 40 years that how we get and use energy will be much more important in our career than it was in yours. Now, out of the mouths of very bright young people, and the faculty immediately recognized that this was true and asked around. And because of my time in government, where I was particularly concerned with the use of energy in buildings and taking a look at energy systems at the national scale, I volunteered and was asked and led for the 6 years before I retired a course called Present and Future Energy Systems for the final year undergraduates and the master's students at Cambridge University. And my first lecture was entirely about the scale of the problem, with just some of the numbers involved. And these people were, you could see their mouths drop when you said, the sort of example I have, if you take the whole of the eastern part of England, which is very flat, it's called the Fen country. It's sort of a bit like Holland, it's so flat. This is where 4,000 square kilometers, this is where much of the food for London and other parts of England is grown. If we took that whole area, 4,000 square kilometers, and turned it over to miscanthus, which is the most rapidly growing grass, and we cut that grass down and we burnt it, we could generate about 1.5 gigawatts of electricity. And everybody says, well, that's a lot. But then you go to the coast where there's a nuclear power station, which in 300 meters by 300 meters has a nuclear power station. It generates 1.5 gigawatts of electricity. The ratio of the land area used is 40,000 to 1. Now, if you say, well, growing grass isn't that good, let's put windmills and solar panels, you can get that ratio down from 40,000 to 1, but it's still 2,000 to 1. And if you talk to an engineer saying, I can do it this way or that way, and by the way, there's a coefficient of performance as far as land use is concerned of 2,000 to 1, most engineers would say that you're silly to even propose the dilute version, namely covering the whole of East Anglia with state-of-the-art solar panels.
Yes, this is what concerns me, and I think, one of the things that I look at is, and I'd bring up and talk to people is, I maybe it's to me it seems obvious, but then I talk to people and they're like, I was having a conversation with a colleague, and it's like, well, we're starting to get into these solar things, and then I said, well, the sun doesn't shine, so what are we going to do? And I said, well, batteries, and we've talked about all this, and I started thinking of made the same argument about materials, and it's just like people's eyes glaze over. So I think what concerns me, and I think we've touched on a little bit, is we've set these goals out to 2050, and we've said we're going to have net zero emissions, which is ridiculous. It can't happen even if you want to use renewables. I mean, you can't do it. Just to manufacture the equipment would require steel making and all these things we talked about, metal smelting, which have emissions. So, and I think that there's this quest or this idea that I hear from a lot of folks is that, well, we need something on the scale of, the challenge that President Kennedy made to go to the moon, or we need this, we need to order this. Then you start getting into these kind of blurry ideas about, well, we need to reorder society. If we reordered society and made this our focal point, we could do this. It's just a desire. The desire isn't there. The will isn't there to do it. And that kind of discussion, without getting into politics, really bothers me because.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned one president, because in one other lecture I give, I talk about three presidents. The point is that when John Kennedy said in 1961 that we will go to the moon by 1970, his chief scientific and engineering advisors would have been telling him, look, Mr. President, there's no parts of the physics of this problem that are unknown. There's a whole lot of energy systems that have to be put together that have never been put together again, that we cannot see any no-show factor or stopgap or stop, whatever the word is, the one that's an abrupt stop. Showstopper is the word I was talking. There's no showstoppers. So, and furthermore, when the president said that, it wasn't as though every American citizen had to get up an hour early and work harder. It meant that about probably 400,000 space engineers worked very hard for 10 years and pulled it off. Now, that happened in, 1969, 1970. But in 1971, President Nixon then said, well, look what we've done with space. I'm going to appropriate $100 million, and we're going to cure cancer in the next decade. Now, 50 years later, we're still trying to cure cancer, and there would have been no scientific advisor telling the president that a cure for cancer is around the corner. We've just got to devote money to it. And I think that it'd be very interesting to put some of the current scientific advisors to the president and other leaders on the spot, saying, would you put your own pension funds into the enterprise that is to deliver these targets? And most of them will say no, they just want something more certain. I mean, the idea that, let me just give you one other thing that's particularly on the hot desk at the moment in this country. We have a regulator called Ofgem, and it's the regulator that oversees the electricity supply industry and makes sure that what are in effect local monopolies can't charge extortionate amounts. And they have a 5-yearly negotiation. Well, the latest thing is that the Ofgem wants to cut the amount of capital investment that the grid will do over the next few years so as to keep the price down for the consumers. Now, that is exactly the opposite of what's required if we're ever going to meet the 2050 target. The estimates are that we would have to treble the average spend on the national grid infrastructure, that's the generation and the distribution and the transmission. We would have to treble that spend and hold it at that trebled level for the next 30 years to reach 2050 target in terms of the ability of the energy grid to supply an electrified form of heating, an electrified form of transport for this country. And so when you have the regulator now going in exactly the opposite direction, what it means is that in the end, if we don't have the electricity grid, that means that all these people who did all their own work, to make their homes green and the assumption that the electricity would be there, are going to be landed with vast quantities of stranded assets. because they'll all still, when they really need to go 200 miles, they'll have to hire a fossil fuel car, because the others, there won't be enough electricity around. You see, one of the problems they have, and I've heard it in the US as well, saying, well, why can't we just charge batteries, use up, store extra energy in the batteries during the day and use it at night? Well, it turns out in this country that the day-night expansion is far too high to cope with that sort of thing for the being able to keep the grid actually powered by some kind of battery storage. There's all sorts of problems. Here's another one. I went as a scientific advisor to the Minister of Science and said, look, nearly all the buildings, 85% of the buildings that are in the United Kingdom right now are going to be present in 2050. And we're going to have to retrofit them all so that each of the houses we have, 27 or 28 million of them, will only use 1/5 the CO2 that they do now. And I said, this is going to be a very big problem. Everybody concentrates on new build. Let's design a new house that's super efficient. But you've got these rows and rows of houses, and you can stand anywhere in Manhattan or in Chicago and look anywhere you like and see vast buildings that all have to be retrofit. So I went to the science minister and I said, this is a huge problem. And he said, what do you suggest? And I said, I suggest we do a pilot program. So he put aside 17 million pounds, probably $40 million, or no, $30 million. And a whole lot of houses were retrofitted, over 100 were retrofitted to reduce their carbon emissions with a target of 80% reduction. The average target that was got was only a 60% reduction. And the cost was about £85,000, nearly $150,000 per house. When you scale all that up to every house, you suddenly get a figure of £2 trillion for the UK, which would be $3 trillion, and then treble, 60 million here versus 350 there, another 6. You suddenly get figures of 20 or 30 trillion dollars. Who's going to pay for that? And what is it that we would have done with that $30 trillion that we're not going to do so we can retrofit the houses? Nobody talks about this.
No, indeed. We're getting close to the end of our time, but I have a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
I think we have a real-time lab for this, or a pseudo lab, if you will.
Yep.
I'm a keen observer of the energy transition in Germany, which has not met its goals. They continue to move the goalposts. It's constantly foot kicked back and forth. And now you end up in a situation where you have a country that has spent, I've been there, I've seen these ridiculous solar farms on the Baltic Sea. In the wintertime, you get 1 hour of irradiance. But anyways, $600 billion.
And they're covered with 50 centimeters of snow.
Exactly. So you have $600 billion spent, no net reduction in emissions. You have some of the highest, if not the highest, electricity rates in Europe. And these are an anchor on the competitiveness of the country. And so why, when we look at these things, we have a lab, a real life lab, a country has tried this, and it just appears to be ignored. And do you have any comment on that? Have you looked at the energy transition?
I'm not, if I was to say I'm in despair, I haven't quite got that far. But what I really do think is that the National Academy of Engineering and the Royal Academy in the US and the Academy here and the equivalent organization in Germany should be speaking out about this. I've tried internally in the UK to get these academies to discuss this. And they say, look, it's just too difficult a problem. We don't want to. So the one comment that was made a few years ago to me from the Engineering Academy was, we don't want to go out there and speculate on this. It was the scientists who caused the problem. We're just going along for the ride. But if we were to go and say this is impossible, we would be dismissed as naysayers. And we still want to play a positive role building the future, but we can't do it in the energy sector. Well, I regard this as defeatist. I find it amazing. I don't know. There is an international committee of academies of engineering and technology, and I think they should be the body that should be charged internationally to do a study on this. I'm afraid that nearly all the national academies are compromised on this.
Indeed. It's kind of like, I think it was Thomas Jefferson that said, I would rather have the truth be known and have the truth be known and have the heavens come down. I mean, it's
Yeah.
kind of the same situation. People, I think, people are concerned about careers and concerned about,
Yeah.
like you said, not being dubbed naysayers or swimming upstream. I get it. I see it.
There's another one also that I have to say, the Greens are particularly concerned about the fact that we're handing over a degraded world to our future generation. And I think there are some genuine things about energy efficiency and environmental things of which I'm 100% in favor of, leading a slightly more frugal life all round to keep the planet in balance. But this wholesale rush to some of these things, and I just mentioned earlier, if the electricity isn't ready, grid isn't ready when all the electric cars are there and all the heating things, but there's no electricity because there isn't enough of it. There's going to be vast stranded assets, and we're going to hand over a world to our children, which is far worse than if we'd done nothing.
No, indeed.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
No, that's it. It's a sort of a hypocritical nature of it. And as soon as I try gently to just raise this, I just get people's eyes raised and, they want to change the subject.
No, it's the current zeitgeist, and
You're exactly right.
I get it. It's fashionable now. I think I was talking to one of my friends. Well, he's an acquaintance, and he's probably been in the nuclear industry for 40 years. He's retired, and he's a very intelligent guy. And we discussed this, and I said, what's going to change this? He said, what's going to change it is they're going to go down this path, hell bent to do it. The costs are going to be there, and then people, the actual people, the voters, the consumers are going to say, this is enough, this is ridiculous. When the costs actually begin to manifest and it actually starts affecting people, then that's when it will end, because it just won't be possible. And you're already seeing that in Germany, especially in the eastern side of Germany, where the people are still behind a little bit. There are moratoriums on these things. They understand. They don't want to have 50 cent per kilowatt hour electricity. They kind of get it. So I think you're starting to see the pushback.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm just to interject there for a minute. What I'm really interested in is that I could imagine in the mid-30s this particular scenario you're talking about coming, a massive crash because all of this misinvestment has come, and then people were saying, but didn't anybody see this coming? It's a bit like the Queen went to the London School of Economics just after the crash of 10 years ago and asked the professors, didn't any of you see this coming? And they subsequently wrote a report and said, well, no, we were too self-absorbed in our mathematical models to actually think about the real world. And so I think it's the modeling and of these engineering issues. Oh, by the way, there's a lot of modeling going on by economists. And I have to tell you, the laws of thermodynamics don't seem to feature anywhere. If any modeling by an engineer, if they were to violate the laws of thermodynamics, all hell would be to pay. They'd get nowhere. And so I'm concerned to the extent that a lot of these debates are being led by economists.
Exactly, who've predicted.
And a further thing that I found when I was in government, you see, the language of economics is the first and second and third language in Whitehall, in the civil service, or inside the Beltway in the US. Only after that do you have the law and operations research and statistical integrity and science. But the other problem about economics is, at its heart, economics starts with a model where the market is 100% efficient. And as you look at various defects, that efficiency of the market drops to 80% or to 60% or something like that. In engineering, it's exactly the opposite. You start with a whole load of materials and you have a final product. You have for the final product, and you have a final product because it isn't made, it's 0% efficient. And you make it the first time, you get a 10% efficient machine. You make it the second time, you get 25, and eventually you struggle up to 30 or 35%. And engineers are always trying to make things better, whereas the economists are always degrading their system. And this leads to a fundamentally different pair of mindsets. And this is where I think the nexus of the public debate has gone. It's been led too far by Nicholas Stern and not enough by for example, in this country, a man called John Armitt, who built Terminal 5 and the Olympic Park and that sort of thing, a man who's a thoroughly professional engineer from A to B and successful at it as well. So it's this mismatch between the thinking of economics and engineering, which is at the heart of this problem in the public debate.
No, and I think it's going to come to like when I experienced when I was working for large utilities, we would come up with a project and from an engineering project for an improvement in a plant system. And the first thing that the accounting department, the plant manager, and his general manager would ask is, what's the payback on this thing?
Yep.
And we're like, okay, well, it's a year and a half. Okay, go forward. If we came in there with a project that had a 10-year payback, they'd throw us out. And if we came in with 2 of those, they'd be saying, start looking for another job. So, I mean, that's...
But yes. I have to say, we have an official committee in this country called the Committee on Climate Change. And I've been trying to debate with them, but they will not touch me with a barge pole. But they have things that I've written to them and said, this report that you're quoting, if this had come out of an engineering consultancy, the chief executive would have been fired, along with the entire team that wrote the report. This is just totally substandard engineering, but it passes for reasonable economics. I'll have all my economist friends jumping in on me as a result of this, but that's what I think.
No, indeed. So I think we've kind of covered all the topics on your paper. We didn't want this to go too long, but I do want to point out one thing which I did like, and I don't know if you used to be a boxer in your youth or not, but it just seems that you are, this one paragraph here at the end I kind of just wanted to touch on, said, concerning the target of a net zero emissions economy for the UK in 2050, the views of the Climate Change Committee and me are inconsistent. This cannot be allowed to stand since at present major misinvestments are being made, which will be on one hand make sense, or on the other sabotage our economy in pursuit of an unachievable pipe dream. I issue a direct challenge to anyone to comprehensively discredit my report by pointing out errors of facts, data, or logic in coming to my conclusions. And then it says GWPF will publish a serious takedown, but not any marginal quibbling. So quick comment on that. I mean, it seems like you're ready to engage with folks.
I'm ready to engage with anybody. In fact, I sent that report to the Climate Change Committee, and the secretary to the chief executive wrote back saying, we choose not to engage with you on this matter at this time. So there you have it. Now, the only thing is I also wrote another piece which was in a public magazine here, which basically said, if you don't have a route map to 2050, you've got a pipe dream. And funny enough, I see now that in December, the Climate Change Committee is going to try and publish what in effect will be a route map. And so that's when I think the scales will fall off the eyes of many of the readers. That is if they tell the full and an unvarnished truth.
Indeed. So we've covered a lot of ground. Like I said, this paper is pretty short. I'm going to include it in the show notes for the folks. But I see that you do have some YouTube videos. Do you still do lectures? Or, I mean, how do you engage on this?
I do some occasionally, but yes, I'm still up for it. I was going to be at a seminar in the Danish parliamentary buildings last week, but of course it's all been closed off for COVID. John, I've got one request. If you get any feedback on this lecture, could you let me have a digest? I'm always keen because, for example, in the lecture I gave at Christmas, there were 2 mistakes of mine. And I always started that lecture that if anybody can find a mistake in my paper anywhere, please let me know, because I have no interest in peddling half-truths. So if you get any feedback, I'd appreciate getting to hear.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's intellectually honest on your part.
Absolutely.
I think that your intent here is based on, logic, sound engineering principles. I don't think that you have an agenda. I mean, that's one of the first things we're going to see, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of people that that are biased towards certain ideas, and they're just going to say, well, this guy's another tool of the fossil fuel industry.
Yes,
that's the quibbling we talk about, So it's like, do you want to engage on the facts and the logic? And the man said he's ready to stand there and do that. So yes, I'll definitely, but expect, I think a lot of people have their minds made up one way or another, like they do on most things. And but I still like to talk about these things because my primary objective here is that for this particular thing that I do is what are the investment implications, and for how do my listeners and readers take advantage of that. So anyway, we definitely appreciate you coming on, Dr. Kelly. This is very interesting, and we're gracious with your time. I know it's valuable, and definitely appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we leave?
No, I think my only comment would be to those people who are convinced that the green agenda is the one, as I'm asking them to make sure they put all their pension investments into that and have the consequence.
Okay, that's good.
If they're not prepared to do it, then they are inconsistent themselves.
No, and I think that's correct. You're correct in that. All right, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye now, and thanks very much, John.
Yep, bye.